Hello and welcome to the Research into Practice video series. The video series is intended to showcase research undertaken by social workers in Wales as part of the Continuous Professional Education and Learning Programme, or CPEL. So as part of the CPEL programme, students are encouraged to research something which is a hot topic or something that concerns them within their area of practice. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about the area of research that you chose and why you chose it.
Yes, sure. The research that I carried out was research that looked at the role of the corporate parent in shaping the identity of children who were care experienced or in aftercare services. So in particular looking at their autobiographic narrative, so the stories that they tell about themselves, how they speak about themselves, how they think about themselves as a result of their experiences of being in care.
So can you just say a little bit about for you why that's important, why those stories are important, and for us to understand those narratives?
Well, as a result of my experience of being a looked after children's social worker prior to my current role, I found that there were lots of children who'd been through the care system, and I was intrigued about the way that they described themselves and thoughts about themselves, and I wanted to see whether or not the Social Services Wellbeing Act had any different role and different effect on the corporate parents in terms of shaping the language that children use to describe themselves. And one of the things that I found was that under previous legislation used in Wales, children would refer to themselves as I am a Section 20. So although the legislation didn't describe the child, it described their life events, children would, as a result of the way the corporate parents parented them, they would adopt that and apply it as an identity descriptor. What I found from the research with children and young people this time was a similar thing, in that young people were using terms such as them being a category, which is an unhelpful term, and I think the new legislation takes it one step further. Rather than describing the child's circumstances, and then in practice then, unfortunately, people start describing, using that description to describe the child rather than their circumstances. The new legislation actually describes and categorises the child as a category. One child is ... So we found that was unhelpful for the way that children started to think about themselves.
Having chosen your area of research, I was wondering if you explain briefly how you went about the study that you undertook.
So I carried out interviews with children and young people in one particular county because I wanted to look at the role of the corporate parent. I thought it would be more helpful to look at one county initially so that the findings could be extrapolated to more easily to care within that same county rather than trying to make assumptions cross-county based. Once I'd carried out the interviews with young people, I analysed the data to look at certain themes that were coming out in terms of identity descriptors, why they described themselves in that particular way, in that particular moment to me, and why they thought about themselves in that way, in that moment. So it was something called situational subjectivity. And that was important because the relationship between the corporate parent and themselves as a child sort of replicated an attachment relationship. The corporate parents and the child, what we know is that children from a young age start to think about themselves as a certain way as a result of the parents' engagement with them. And I wanted to see whether or not the corporate parents' interactions with them, so it could be the social worker, it could be local governments, it could be the education department, it could be the foster carers, support workers, all these different individuals who are in the role of corporate parent, did they and their interactions with the child start to shape the way that they thought about them?
Could you explain to me what the key findings were? What were the main things that you found as part of doing the study that you undertook?
So one of the things that I found was that within the term corporate parent, there's this lens that is two-sided. So there's the kind of corporate/parent side, and there needs to be equity in those two identity terms that form that whole. And the experiences of children who'd been looked after varied from time to time, either as a result of what was going on in their life or as a result of the individual who represented the corporate parents at that time, so whether or not it was foster carer or social worker or a support worker and so on and so forth. So what we found was there were times when the child would experience an imbalance in those two terms of corporate parent instead of an equity, and they'd experience more of a corporate parent response rather than a corporate parent response. And what we do want is we want them to have a corporate parent response, so an increase in the parental response within that corporate parent identity rather than an unweighted, heavily corporate response and the parental aspect being reduced. Another of the findings in my research was stories told and not told. And basically that explains that when children have had quite traumatic life events and gone into the care system, what they found was the adults around them were too scared to talk to them about those traumatic life events, that the events, the talking about them would be too overwhelming for the adults. So it's not that the children themselves couldn't cope with the experiences that they'd lived through and survived through, but the adults that they were then being cared for by or social workers around them felt, oh, we can't talk to the kids about this because it's too difficult, but it was actually too difficult for the adults. That absence of talking to children about their traumatic life events was the thing that then led to a shaping of the children's identity, which said something like, what we've been through is too difficult for our foster carers or our social workers to manage. Therefore, does that mean that we're too much to be parented? Are we too difficult or scary to be parented because these adults won't talk to us about what we've been through? Another of the findings was depersonalising and distancing language. And what the children described was that language within legislation, such as Social Services Wellbeing Act, where it describes children as categories rather than as a child, and it refers to the child themselves rather than their experience and their situation. And also electronic recording systems and systems used by local authorities all led to a depersonalising of the child and using more corporate-focused language, such as referring to children as a case rather than as a child. And also language such as working with a child rather than parenting them. Another finding was around children's experiences being more corporate-oriented rather than personal-oriented. And that was around any times when children had the corporate parents explore with them, well, what's it like for you in our care and how can we be different? Those explorations tended to be evaluation focused rather than experience focused. So they'd focus quite often on things like, has a child achieved certain targets at certain stages through looked after children's review processes, rather than what's it like for them to live separate from their siblings, for example. And so that almost became an evaluation and a scoring, for example, of the care of the corporate parent, rather than actually a more closely personalised focus on the experience of the child. The final finding of my research was around a temporally static or regressive identity, and it meant that all these language issues that I was talking about earlier affected children when they move on from care. So that even when children were leaving care, they'd still refer to themselves as either in care or as care leavers. And for older children, even when they were aware of older adults who were care experienced, they still referred to those care experienced adults as care leavers. That then begged the question as to at what stage does an individual stop thinking of themselves as a care leaver and start thinking of themselves instead as care experienced. And the corporate parent had a role in that which wasn't always helpful, where it would try and consult with individuals who were care experienced to help shape their policy, but would still be referring to them as care leavers. And we're talking individuals who are early 30s, late 20s with their own families and still being referred to as care leavers.
Right.
So that wasn't always the intention was positive from the corporate parent side, but the focus kept those individuals in a temporally static or regressive identity of still being in care, whereas they maybe left since 20 years.
As part of the CPEL programme, students are expected to share what they found with colleagues. I was wondering if you could say a little bit about how you went about sharing your research findings and what the reaction was to what you found as part of doing the research.
So I'm a member of the All Wales Consultant Social Worker Steering Group, and that has been a fantastic platform for me to be able to disseminate my research and to be able to co-produce research that's followed on from my CPEL research, and to do that with other local authorities such as in Swansea and Cardiff, other areas in Mid Wales, Aberystwyth, and along other sections of the North Wales coastal region as well. I've also presented my research in a few different conferences that have been run by practitioners and for practitioners in Wales. So there's been various different opportunities for me to share.
The Research into Practice video series. The video series is intended to showcase research undertaken by social workers in Wales as part of the Continuous Professional Education and Learning Programme, or CPEL. Research is undertaken by social workers working in both adults and children's services. The videos are intended to be short, bite-sized summaries of the research that they've undertaken and the findings from their studies.